Can I get a mic check? Testing 1, 2. All right. Hey, Thomas. Good. Welcome. Eric, Bismar, George. Let me hold on 1 second. All right. Tonight we'll talk about denying the resurrection. And I mentioned the last time that I thought this was Lord willing, an interesting study. It's a little bit different, but still, nevertheless, I hope we might be able to see the message of the gospel. Now, what does it mean for someone to deny the resurrection? Thomas, can you hear me? It seems like you're having a little bit of problem with Paltalk, staying logged in. Thomas? Okay, all right, good. Yeah, so denying the resurrection, what is that all about? Let's take a look at a few verses here in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Now, what I'm going to propose tonight is that those who deny the resurrection, in essence, what they're doing is that they are I am on the roof of a house. Yeah, well, be careful. Don't hurt yourself, Thomas. Yeah. So those who deny, isn't Christ the resurrection? Doesn't the Bible teach that? Where do we read that? I have that verse here. So they deny the resurrection. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 12. And ultimately, I want to get to a verse that appears to be contradictory, but I think, Lord willing, we might see how it relates to the overall picture. Now, if Christ be preached that he rose from the dead, how say some among you that there is no resurrection of the dead? Who are these that are saying there is no resurrection? Verse 13. And if there be no resurrection of the dead, then Christ is not risen. So what it appears to be is that if one denies the future resurrection, now keep in mind that Christ had already risen, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong. When this was being penned. So Christ had already risen, yet there are those who deny the resurrection. I think the context there is really looking at the future resurrection. Would you agree with that? They are denying the future resurrection, and in denying the future resurrection, it appears that they're also denying the historical resurrection and a historical account. Verse 14, if Christ be not risen, then is our preaching vain, and your faith is also vain. Okay, so we're looking at a resurrection to come. Acts chapter 24, verse 15. And have hope toward God, which they themselves also allow, that there shall be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and unjust. So there was a resurrection to come at the time that this was being talked about. In verse 8, Acts chapter 23, for the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, neither angel nor spirit, but the Pharisees confessed both. Acts chapter 17, verse 32. And when they heard of the resurrection that Paul was talking about, some mocked, and others said, we will hear thee again of this matter. So in other words, they're not interested in the resurrection. They're not acknowledging that, first of all, there had been a resurrection, and certainly they're not in agreement, it appears, with a future resurrection, a day of the Lord, judgment day. And those who mock, if we study the Bible carefully, we begin to see that these relate to the unsaved in the church. Psalm 35:16, hypocritical mockers and feast, they gnash upon me with their teeth. And also Genesis 21, verse 9. We read about Sarah, the son of Hagar. Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, which she had borne unto Abraham, mocking. So those who mock, I believe, is looking at the unsaved, the tares in the church. So can we begin to see perhaps the tie-in there between those who deny the resurrection, how it seems to relate also to those that are mockers, the mockers in the church body. Luke chapter 20, verse 27, then came to him certain of the Sadducees which deny that there is a resurrection. And they asked him. And we'll see in the context, even though they're speaking of they're thinking of a literal resurrection, Christ, I believe, begins to set the record straight when he speaks of those in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage. And we're going to see that in a few minutes. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 1, even denying those who bring damnable heresies, even denying the Lord that bought them. So when someone denies the resurrection, Christ is the resurrection. In essence, they are denying Christ. That seems to make sense, right? It follows the same pattern of the state of the church coming into the Great Tribulation. This identifies with the falling away. Luke chapter 20, verse 34, Jesus answering said unto them, children of this world marry and are given in marriage. The children of this world marry and are given in marriage. Verse 35, but they which shall be accounted worthy to obtain that world. And this, I propose, is actually being fulfilled today. And the resurrection from the dead. Christ has risen. The two witnesses stand upon their feet as God now goes about gathering the believers, right, the elect. They neither marry nor are given in marriage. Today, the believers, the marriage is consummated, but it's the marriage to Christ. As far as the unsaved in the church body, now they're no longer partaking of the adultery or the harlotry that was a part of the church. Mark chapter 12, verse 26, as touching the dead that they rise, have ye not read in the book of Moses, how in the bush God spoke unto him, saying, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not a God of the dead, but of the living. So the believers identify with Christ. They identify with the resurrection of the dead. And today, by God's grace, only the elect. God is bringing about a strong delusion. And it's also a time of the sin of blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, where evil appears to be good and good appears to be evil. So therefore, God is blinding, right? That, I believe, is part of the judgment process. But the believers, they rise. God is a God of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So he is not a God of the dead. So the resurrection identifies altogether with Christ and the elect. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 3, knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers walking after their own lust, saying, where is the promise of his coming? Isn't that interesting? Wouldn't this also imply, where is Christ? Christ is the resurrection. I am the resurrection and the life. Where is he? Where is the promise of his coming? With these, do you suppose these would identify again with the ones who deny the resurrection? They deny the day of the Lord. They deny judgment on the church. John chapter 11, verse 24. Martha saith unto him, I know that he shall rise again in the resurrection at the last day. When is the last day? When is the last day? Is that October 21 or some other date that we can actually come to understand from the Bible? Yeah, George, the day of the Lord is the last day. And I think, Lord willing, that's very important, because if we have the day and the hour in the wrong place spiritually, then many other doctrines, I believe, also will be out of place. Would you agree with that? That's why, a lot of times when I talk to someone, I try to get a feel for how they understand the day of the Lord. If they're looking at the day of the Lord as the 5 months on the calendar or the very last day, then I can almost guarantee you, Lord willing, that you're not going to make any progress as far as sharing the gospel. God has to open their understanding to see that the day of the Lord is judgment. And it's already here because God has unsealed the Bible, I believe. So, at the resurrection on the last day, he shall rise again. And in verse 25, Jesus said unto her, I am the resurrection and the life. Just like, when Christ would say, I am the truth and the life, right? So the resurrection identifies with Christ. And then here he speaks of he that believeth in me, though he were dead, and the church body was dead, coming into tribulation, now God has brought about the resurrection. Christ is revealed. Though he were dead, yet shall he live. Now, let's look at 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 16. But shun profane and vain babblings. Now, this is an area, again, I believe, why we would confirm that God is the one who has to define the terms. And so if we read verses on the surface, we might come perhaps to a premature conclusion. Now look at here in verse 16. So shun profane and vain babbling, they will increase unto more ungodliness. And then in Proverbs 23, 29, and 30, woe have woe. Who have woe? Who have sorrow? Who have contentions? Who have babbling? And then God relates this to those who seek mixed wine. They're not looking for the pure wine that is Christ. And that, I believe, would be associated with a false gospel. So God begins to define the terms here, I believe. Profane babbling, 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 20. O Timothy, keep that which is committed to thy trust, avoiding profane and vain babblings and opposition of science. Now the word science there would have been more properly translated knowledge. Luke chapter 11, verse 52. Woe unto you, lawyers, for ye have taken away the key of knowledge. So who are they today who oppose knowledge? Who are they that oppose knowledge? Babylon, right? The church. Babylon rises in a time of judgment. God allows the locusts. He allows Satan to exalt his throne above the stars of God. And then Christ is revealed to judge the body. And at the same time bring the believers out of tribulation, out of Babylon. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 17. And their word. That, I think, is tying right into babbling, vain babbling, opposition of science. Their word will eat as doth a canker, of whom is Hymenaeus and Philetus. 2 Timothy 2, verse 18. Who concerning the truth, now who is the truth? I am the way, the truth, and the life. That's Christ again, right? He is the truth, he is the resurrection. Who concerning the truth have erred, saying that the resurrection is past already. Well, that's interesting, because as I said, in the context, Christ had risen. So perhaps in the historical account, they are relating to the actual resurrection of Christ, the physical resurrection. But we read earlier, at least I alluded to the fact that if they deny a future resurrection, it appears that they are also denying the fact that Christ had risen. Does that make sense? So I'm not really sure what it is that's in view here as far as a historical account, but if you look at the context carefully, God appears to be associating those that are claiming that the resurrection is already past to those who deny that there is a resurrection. Does that make sense? And also, he is tying it into vain babbling. Bismarck writes, they are talking about the revelation of Christ. Well, that's exactly the point. I'm not sure. In this context here, the historical account, it seems that even if they were talking about a physical resurrection, I don't want to go back here. Maybe we'll come back to that a little bit later. If they are looking at the physical resurrection, yeah, that also can fit, I believe, into the overall picture. But at the same time, these are the ones that are denying a resurrection to come. So the two, it doesn't really seem to match how you can actually believe that Christ has risen. And like I said, we'll come back to that verse. Those who deny a future resurrection, it seems they are also denying that Christ had risen. And if that's the case, then their faith is vain. Now, I don't want to go back because I've already posted these verses, but if someone can think of the verse that I'm referring to, maybe you can post it on the screen just as a reminder. All right, but we'll come back to that again, as I said. So, who concerning the truth have erred? Now, we know in the context, again, God here appears to be, he's not, he is talking about the unsaved, I believe, the tares in the church, those who err, right? Saying that the resurrection is past. Well, how is it that someone could actually be saying that? We know today, if we look at the church, this would not seem to tie in either, because the church believes that there is a future resurrection. The church believes that Christ has risen. Would you agree? They believe that Christ has risen. So they believe in a physical resurrection. They also believe that there is a resurrection to come. They're just not seeing that as a spiritual resurrection. So that's why, again, in the context, if you read that, it does not seem to make sense that those that, they err, they fall away, and yet they're saying that the resurrection is past, as if to say they are not looking for a future resurrection. And overthrow the faith of some. All right, let's take a look at those who err for a moment. George writes, yes, that he rose and the people will rise again. But both the church and the calendar group believe this. Yeah, that's the point that I'm trying to make here, George. So they do believe, but they're looking for a future resurrection. Yeah, but they're not seeing that the revelation of Christ, they're not seeing the resurrection as being spiritual. And I think this, Lord willing, is the foundation of the of this study and the verses that I'm offering here. And we'll see that later on. Okay, so Let's go back again to 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 17. And their word, I'm going to post these verses again, will eat as doth a canker, of whom Hymenaeus and Philetus. And then in verse 18, who concerning the truth, that's Christ again, let's see if this will post, have erred, saying that the resurrection is past already. So those that are saying the resurrection is past already, they seem to be identified with the unbelievers, because they are denying the spiritual. They're denying today. I believe this ties into those who would deny that Christ has come. 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 6, from which some have swerved, that's the same word, have turned aside unto vain jangling. There it is again. Vain babbling, vain jangling. Those who oppose science, they oppose knowledge. These are the ones that are denying, I believe, the resurrection. 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 20, of whom is Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I have delivered unto Satan, that they may learn not to blaspheme. Well, again, here's another tie-in there. But we know that those who blaspheme, especially today in the context of judgment and the revelation of Christ, it is Babylon. And the time of blasphemy against the Holy Spirit is when God brings judgment to those who deny Christ. They think that he is of Satan. And that's because Antichrist is ruling in the body. But the blasphemy against the Holy Ghost shall not be forgiven unto them. Hebrews chapter 3, verse 10. Wherefore I was grieved with that generation, and said, they do always err in their heart, and they have not known my ways. Again, talking about Babylon, I believe. Brethren, if any of you do err from the truth, and one convert him. I'm going to post all the related verses there. I just want to underline the nature of those that they err, they fall away, they deny Christ, they deny the resurrection. And if they're saying that the resurrection is past already, that seems to be related to vain jangling. God defines the terms, right? It is vain jangling, it is vain babbling, and they're not to be a part of that, the believers. Okay, now, what about the resurrection? Now today we understand by God's grace that Christ has come. He has been revealed. The two witnesses stand upon their feet. So there comes a time when one has to acknowledge that the resurrection has already come. Does anyone here, would anyone deny or perhaps not see that Christ has been revealed through the Bible? We read about the resurrection from the dead. John chapter 5, verse 28, marvel not at this, for the hour is coming, and just as the last day, the hour I propose is the day of the Lord, the day and the hour, in the which all that are in the grave shall hear his voice, and shall come forth, some to the resurrection of life, and some to the resurrection of damnation. So there is the resurrection, but I don't believe this is, I'm not saying that God is not going to literally raise the dead. I'm just saying, as far as comparing the Bible with the Bible, we have to look for the substance. God identifies the graves with the hypocrites, the Pharisees. That's the grave today. God had to unseal the Bible so that the believers are actually coming out from under the teachings of men altogether. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! Ye are as graves which appear not. Ezekiel 37, verse 12. Therefore prophesy and say unto them, thus saith the Lord God, behold, O my people, I will open your graves and cause you to come up out of your graves. In the same way, we see the example where Christ resurrected Lazarus from the dead. Lazarus come forth, John 11:43. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 42. So also is the resurrection of the dead. The reason I'm sharing these verses, again, is to show that the resurrection is already here. Now we're looking back at the resurrection. So before this, like the Pharisees and all those during the New Testament church age, where is the promise of his coming? They deny that the resurrection is coming. But today, God, I believe he has enlightened the believers so that they can actually see and understand time and judgment. So they're not denying the resurrection, although that resurrection is in the past. Can you see how there might be a mix-up there when we look at the verse that speaks of those who say that the resurrection is past already? And we can understand why. 1 Corinthians 15:42. So also is the resurrection of the dead. It is sown in corruption. It is raised in incorruption. Well, again, I believe this has to do with separation of wheat and tares. God is establishing New Jerusalem, having escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust. Spiritually, again, I think this is pointing to the redemption of the body. Chapter 15, verse 51. Behold, I show you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. And we talked about these verses before. The last trumpet, I think, again, identifies with the last day, the revelation of Christ. The trumpet shall sound, and the dead shall be raised incorruptible. But God has to unseal the Bible. He has to bring about this kind of revelation. Otherwise, it seems one would be denying that there is a resurrection. This corruptible must put on incorruption. This mortal must put on immortality. And then we also read in Romans chapter 8, verse 21, because the creature itself shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption. That's the resurrection, right? And here's an interesting verse. I'm not going to get into too much detail right now. It's been a while since I looked at this. But again, it speaks of a better resurrection here. Hebrews 11:35. Women received their dead raised to life again. And others were tortured, not accepting deliverance. And this, I believe, it does relate spiritually to coming into the Great Tribulation. Those who do not want to be identified with false gospels. And then ultimately it's because they would be looking towards a better resurrection. But we'll have to probably have to come back to that and see if we can elaborate further. Matthew chapter 27, verse 52, and the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints which slept arose. Now that's after, or that's at the cross. And then we read about the resurrection of, in Matthew 27:53 here, and came out of the graves after his resurrection. Would you say that this relates to what's going on today? You notice how God was careful to wait until after the resurrection of Christ. It appears that some actually, they were resurrected, literally, from the grave. And that would have been a picture, it seems, of the departed out. And today, the believers, they appear unto many. It is a great cloud of witnesses. And that would have to be through the Bible again, as God reveals understanding, knowledge. Okay, so what I'm offering here, let me go ahead and post the conclusion. The Bible, I'll do it in two parts. Bear with me one second. The Bible appears to be equating denying the resurrection to the unsaved body denying Christ. And we know that Christ is the resurrection. The historical account seems to point to those denying the future coming. Whereas today, since the resurrection is past, denying the resurrection seems to relate to the tares, denying Christ, the fact that he has already come. Can you see that? And I think the primary reason might be because they are looking for a physical manifestation, a literal resurrection. And that would not be an accident because, today, because the Bible is spiritual, God reveals the spiritual. He expounds on the parables. He brings truth. He brings revelation. And only those who identify with Christ ultimately will understand the spiritual nature of the gospel. So is it possible that when God speaks of denying the resurrection, he is really looking at the tares? And that, I think, is still happening today, Lord willing. Not looking at a physical manifestation. George writes, could it be that the resurrection is still occurring as he reveals himself while separating? Oh, yeah, definitely. When I say that the resurrection is past, the vision is for an appointed time. And in the end, it would speak. So there had to come a time when God would actually begin the separation process. But that's considered, spiritually the body has risen. And now God, I believe, we read elsewhere in the Bible where at the end God sends the angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they gather together his elect from the four winds. So every time someone actually receives revelation, in essence, they are stepping into the resurrection. They receive knowledge. But as far as the official start of it, that would have coincided, Lord willing, with the revelation of Christ. Does that make sense? So so we are looking at a resurrection. It is spiritual. But there are those today, somehow they're not relating to the spiritual resurrection of Christ. They seem to gravitate more to the physical resurrection. So is it possible that God is admonishing, or God is warning them, that because we read earlier that if they deny the future resurrection, that is the spiritual resurrection, in essence they seem to be denying also that Christ had risen. And that would put them in a category of those whose faith is vain. Eric writes, it seems as if the confusion is centered around the return of Christ. Yeah, precisely. That's what I'm offering here. And again, Lord willing, this is why I think it's very, very important that we understand that Christ has been revealed, because it affects how we witness to others. If we set aside this information, we're not looking at the fact that God calls for the watchman to sound the alarm, to blow the trumpet, and we're simply telling people about God saving a great multitude. And in essence, what I believe is happening is that we're denying that the day of the Lord is here. And we might be giving others false assurance. We're denying Christ. We're denying the resurrection. All right, bear with me 1 second. Let me turn off the recorder for this session, and then we'll continue with the discussion.